Hello, I'm back. I'm going to read this in a separate section. It's King George, and the title of this is, I'm halfway through this chapter, and it's called Heirs to the Throne, and I'm breaking it up a little bit because each is like 30 pages. So, this George, he is such a fascinating heir to the throne. So we're going to read more about this section. So I hope you'll be interested in listening. I did another part in an earlier episode just a few minutes ago, but I'm breaking this up so that, it's an easier listen for people, because some of these books, even on Audible books, you're either listening to them for 30 minutes or 50 minutes, and that's a lot to listen to. And I don't want to skip parts because I like to just enjoy reading for the sake of reading. And when I'm reading it, I want to really take the time to read every word, because these books are very well written. So I'll get started. We're on page 50. And see, this whole chapter goes up to 75. 70. Actually, it goes up to 75. So that's quite a lot of reading. That would end up being an hour long or an hour and a half long. So, with an annual income of £100,000, the Prince of Wales was a rich man. An agricultural laborer at the turn of the century would expect to earn rather £40 a year. A domestic servant, half that amount. He nevertheless took good care of his money and disappointed his father by refusing to occupy Osborne, Queen Victoria's large Italianate house on the Isle of Wight. He could well afford it, the king urged, having few social obligations and no other country house to maintain, as I can hardly look on the cottage as a country house. The prince, however, disliked large houses and the hospitality required of their owners. So Osborne was handed over to the nation. The staterooms, except for Queen Victoria's own apartments, were open to the public, and the rest turned out into a convalescent home for the officers. The stables became a nucleus of a new junior naval college and successor to the old Britannia, in which Prince George had received his first lessons in seamanship. The Prince of Wales was equally stubborn in declining to leave the York cottage, Sandringham, for a more spacious house in Norfolk. The king, who knew precisely the style in which an heir to the throne should live, thought he had found just the thing for his son. Lord Esher described the expedition. I have been driving with the king most of today. He went to Hutton, Cholmondeley's place, a special house built by Walpole, but frighteningly neglected owing to poverty, a sleepy hollow of a park. Possibly the Duke of York may rent it. We drive 8 miles in 19 minutes in the king's motor. Really very pleasant, only you have to wear spectacles. King Edward's expedition was in vain. The Wales family remained in the cramped little rooms of York Cottage for the next 25 years. They were grateful, however, to be lent one of the most delectable and least known of royal residences for their occasional use during the summer. Frogmore House. Frogmore House. Oh my gosh. No, it's Frogmore Cottage that Harry and Meghan neglected. But Frogmore House. Okay. It was barely a mile from Windsor Castle, but was built in the reign of William and Mary, purchased a century later by the Queen Charlotte, and refaced by Wyatt in the Georgian style. It's a handsome, colonnaded building of cream-colored stucco. It lies in a secluded corner of the home park. Rooms are manageable size and overlook a pleasing prospect of the lawn, lake, and trees that conceal two mausoleums. One of classic elegance contains the tomb of the Duchess of Kent, Queen Victoria's mother, and a resident of Frogmore House, and the other a cheerless structure of granite and Portland stone. It was built by the Queen to unite her own remains with those of the Prince Consort. It was to Frogmore that the Prince and the Princess of Wales could come to each other for ascot races. Prince May also liked to escape from the bustle of the London season, to spend an afternoon writing letters under lime trees while her children fed the ducks or played hide and seek in the shrubberies. "It's too divine here, and everything is looking lovely," she told her husband. "The house is charming, and it's fresh, and the garden and the grounds are a dream." In widowhood, she arranged some of the rooms and a museum of family history, a harvest of presents and souvenirs from George III to Elizabeth II. There are china animals from the nursery and exercise books from the schoolrooms, Princess Christian's wedding wreath, and a tiny loaf baked on the day of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Let's take a look at that Frogmore house. Okay, look at that. Okay, that's beautiful. In London, the Prince of Wales was obliged to exchange his unpretentious corner of St. James's Palace for the Wren grandeur of Marlborough House, where his father and mother lived for the past 40 years. This time he dispensed with the prosaic tastes of Sir Blundell Maple and allowed his wife a free hand. To her surprise, the king expressed an annoyance that she would want to redecorate the house, although he himself just spent a fortune renovating Buckingham Palace before taking up residence there. "Surely he must know we really cannot go into a filthy, dirty house," she wrote to her husband with unusual asperity, and not even to oblige him. To restore the 18th century rooms to their original proportions, the princess removed the Victorian accretions introduced by her father-in-law. Then she had the ceilings, the cornices, and the paneling stripped of their once fashionable pink and greens. These features she ordered to be painted white with a touch of gilt for relief. It is not known how much the king and queen resented the changes to their old home, but 2 or 3 years later, Princess May was wounded, being omitted from the list of those to whom the king gave the recently published volumes of the Queen Victoria's letters. Nor was Queen Alexandra the most considerate or understanding of mother-in-laws. She would address letters not to Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, but to Her Royal Highness Victoria Mary Princess of Wales. This was a subtly incorrect designation that implied the existence of a whole host of variously named Princesses of Wales. Sometimes the Queen had a disparagement of Princess May, and it was more overt. Suffering from a cold day before a court, she asked King Edward to cancel it. This he refused to do at such short notice. Instead, he invited the Princess of Wales to take his wife's place. The Queen was furious and allowed neither her mistress of the robes nor her other ladies to be present in attendance on the usurper. Even less amiably, she failed to conceal her jealousy of the woman who had won her son's love. While the princess was preparing for the Indian tour in 1905 to 1906, the Queen wrote to the Prince of Wales, "So my poor Georgie has lost his May, who has fled to London to look in her glass. What a bore and a nuisance, but I cannot understand why she would have gone so soon, as dresses for India can take quite such a long time to do, or try, or either." In fairness to Queen Alexandra, it must be remembered that she was a creature of moods, her perception distorted by deafness. At heart, she appreciated the affectionate nature of her daughter-in-law, and occasionally she brought herself to say, "You, my sweet May, are always so dear and nice to me, and whenever I am not quite au fait, on account of my beastly ears, you always, by word or even by turn towards me to make me understand, for which I am most grateful, as nobody can know what I often have to go through." I can speak to that because I have a deaf ear. I mean, I have a good ear and I have a bad ear. I have one deaf ear, so it is kind of hard. So that was nice that May would turn toward her, you know, to help her. It is perhaps remarkable that there were not more collisions of will between Queen Alexandra and Princess May, and none at all between King Edward and Prince George. The values of one generation rarely appeal to the values of the next. The House of Hanover, in particular, has sustained a long history of strife between the sovereign and his heir. Living within a few hundred yards of each other for so much of the year, the two families had additional opportunities for misunderstanding and even estrangement. Their migratory routes overlapped again and again. Both families spent Christmas and the New Year at Sandringham, returning to London in February. The court moved to Windsor in April, with the Prince of Wales a frequent guest. Then back to the capital until the call of Ascot in June. The prince would accompany his father both to the Goodwood races in July and to Cowes in August, where he sailed the king's yacht Britannia. They separated for the early days of the grouse shooting season, but they were soon reunited in Scotland. The king at Balmoral, the prince at the nearby castle, Abergeldy. Sandringham beckoned both father and son for the partridges in October. During the rest of the year, they met again and again on state occasions in London, welcoming foreign monarchs to Windsor, shooting pheasants at any of a dozen hospital houses. Yet the barbaric cosmopolitan father and his self-disciplined, insular son never grated on each other. The king could scarcely bear to be parted from him for more than a week or two at a time, suffered each separation as if it were the last, and rejoiced in each homecoming with exuberant happiness. Whenever he spoke of Prince George, a friend noted, it was with a softening voice and a look, a half smile and a half pathos, which he reserved for those he loved. Bruised by his own exclusion from affairs of state until he was ascended to the throne in his 60th year, the king determined that his heir should be better equipped to succeed him, so the prince received the more important cabinet papers. And whenever he stayed at Windsor, he was given a writing table next to that of his father. Both those privileges would have been inconceivable in the previous reign. Prince George's devotion to his father was no less firm. Certain tremors in the king's private life must have disturbed his own domestic quietude, yet only in once is he known to have ventured a word of protest on learning that the bowling alley at Sandringham had been turned into, of all things, a library. nor would he tolerate censure of his father's conduct by others. The future Archbishop Lang once again expressed regret to the prince that the king attended a Roman Catholic requiem mass for the assassinated King Carlos of Portugal, adding that to find a precedent it would be necessary to go back to James II. Although no champion of ecumenical movements, the prince retorted, "A very good precedent, too." Lang, whose silver tongue never learned the virtue of silence, primly reminded the prince of James II's fate. The Prince of Wales displayed not only the understandable loyalty of a son to his father, but also the awe of a subject for his sovereign. That one king, at least, could do no wrong for him, not so much a constitutional dictum as a literal truth. He took hierarchical view of humanity, the rich king in his castle, the rich prince at his gate. While his father lived, this subservience robbed their intimacy of spontaneity and vigor, and once Prince George had himself succeeded to the throne, it inhibited his own relationship with both his wife and his children. A hurtful legend had pursued the memory of Prince and Princess of Wales, that he was an unkind father, she an unfeeling mother. There is no contemporary evidence to support such a myth, much to disprove it. The children were as happy as any of their generation. Admiral Fisher wrote to his wife from Balmoral in the autumn of 1903. The two little princes are splendid little boys, and they chattered away the whole of their lunchtime, not the faintest shyness. David, the future King Edward VIII, was then age 9, and Bertie, the future King George VI, was then age 7. Nearly half a century later, in the exile of the Duke of Windsor, the eldest child wrote a volume of memoirs entitled A King's Story. In it, he dwelt with irony on the supposed shortcomings of his parents. He admitted, however, that whatever frustrations he recalled in retrospect, the years immediately before and after his father's succession to the throne had been far from miserable. Sandringham, he wrote, possessed most of the ingredients for an idyllic boyhood. A little later, I find today that my diary during that period at Windsor was actually full of sunny and intimate details. There were longer hours exploring the royal estates on bicycles, boisterous games of golf, lavish presents on birthdays, and at Christmas. The Prince of Wales taught his sons to shoot when they were 13, allowing them to roam the coverts at the end of the season in search of stray cock pheasants. He laughed and he joked, the Duke of Windsor recalled, and those were small days at Sandringham, and they provided some of my happiest memories of him. Like the children of most royal families, they worked, and they played alone. Denied the stimulus of a classroom and a football field, they were a highly spirited band of brothers, abetted and sometimes dominated in their schemes of a single sister. Affecting to believe that their French tutor, Monseigneur Hue, yearned for his native diet of frogs, they tricked him into eating a dish of tadpoles on toast. Professor Oswald, who labored to teach them German, was given an even rougher passage. "It is only that the Prince Albert is inattentive," he complained, "but when I scold him, he just pulls my beard." The boys played pranks even on their supposed ogre of a father. One day they watched in ecstasy as the spoon with which he was stirring his tea dissolved in the cup. It came from a joke shop and was made of an alloy with a low melting point. That does not sound like an oppressive father and his dejected children. How then did the legend originate? Mabel, Countess of Airlie, the Prince of May's girlhood friend and subsequently her lifelong companion and lady-in-waiting, wrote in an old age. Okay, this is important. King George V and Queen Mary have often been depicted as stern and unloving parents, but this they most certainly were not. Remembering them in early days at Sandringham before their family was even complete, I believe that they were more conscientious and more truly devoted to their children than the majority of parents in that era. The tragedy was that neither had an understanding of a child's mind. The Victorian upper classes were accustomed to rear their children behind baize doors, employ a whole hierarchy of nannies and nursery maids, governesses, and tutors. To relieve themselves of day-to-day cares, the Prince and the Princess of Wales choosing to spend much of the year in cramped quarters of York Cottage, they saw more of their children than did their contemporaries in spacious country houses. Yet there were constraints in the relationship, and some were avoidable, others inseparable from a royal heritage. While affection was certainly not lacking in my upbringing, the Duke of Windsor wrote, the mere circumstances of my father's position interposed an impalpable barrier that inhibited the closer continuing intimacy of conventional family life. Awed by his approaching succession to the throne and apprehensive of his fitness for the task, the Prince of Wales imposed a rigid pattern of conduct both on himself and on his sons. He loved his children, and he was proud of their good looks. He gave praise where it was due. I must compliment you on your manners and general behavior, he wrote to David in 1907. Everyone was very pleased with you at Cowes. Yet even by the stern standards of age, he was watchful and an exacting father who let nothing go by default. His early years in the Navy had trained him to instant submission, and he saw no reason why his own sons should not benefit from that same discipline. Now that you are 5 years old, he told Bertie, I hope you'll always try and be obedient and do at once what you are told, as you will find it will come much easier to you the sooner you begin. Not many children can ever have received so daunting a birthday letter. The Prince of Wales was a quick temper, which did not spare even the trusted Big, much less his own sons. Children, however, except sudden gusts of adult rage, as among the natural phenomena of a capricious world, like thunderstorms and pallid puddings at bedtime. They find it harder to bear the embarrassing chaff which parents as well as schoolmasters sometimes express good humor. The Prince of Wales, like his father, was a lifelong exponent of the art, practicing it relentlessly on family and friends. During an inspection of the fleet, he caused agonies of shame to the future Lord Mountbatten by loudly inquiring about a rag doll which the young midshipman had dearly loved in childhood. Archbishop Lang, on resuming his duties after an illness that cost him his hair and made him look 20 years older, was greeted by a sovereign with characteristic guffaws, and on one of the very last evenings that King George V dined among friends at Sandringham, he asked a guest, How many woodcock did you shoot today? Followed insistently by the question, And how many did you miss? Archbishops and skilled shots could look after themselves. The young lacked protection against a sustained banter. Some of the jokes to which they were exposed may well have left an emotional scar. King Edward VII, taking his little grandchildren down to Portsmouth for the return of the Ophir from her 8-month cruise, warned them that their parents' faces would have turned quite black from exposure to tropical sun. In the same jovial vein, the Prince of Wales wrote on the birth of his fourth son, Prince Henry, known as Harry. David, of course, asked some very funny questions. I told him that the baby had flown in at the window during the night, and he at once asked where his wings were, and I said they had been cut off. The Victorians brought up their offspring unaided by psychologists, both as heirs to the throne and as a king. The Prince of Wales appeared to treat other people's children with a genial indulgence, which he denied as his own. On shooting mornings, it was his habit at 11 o'clock to eat a sandwich carried for him by a loader in a little silver box. One day, as he had not asked for it at 12 o'clock, the loader gave it to the young son of a Norfolk neighbor who was following the guns. A few minutes later, the king demanded his rations, but in vain. He was hugely amused by the culprit's inadvertent lèse-majesté, and ever afterwards would address him as the boy who ate my sandwiches. He also liked to call on the daughter of another Sandringham neighbor whose father was serving abroad as a governor general of Sudan. "What have you got in your larder today, Penelope?" he would inquire. "I am sure you're a very bad housekeeper." The girl, wishing she could boast of sucking pig and quails in aspic, had to admit nothing more luxurious than cottage pie. "Well," the king replied, "you must not starve while your parents are away." Then to the keeper, "See that Miss Maffey has sent a brace of pheasants and a hare." His own children could never depend on the good humor of those occasional encounters, but then his own children were destined for a royal role which, he believed, could be learned only under a quarter-deck discipline tempered with equally alarming bandage of the gunroom. The Prince of Wales might have established an easier relationship with his family had he been able to commit to paper the affection which he felt in his heart but found so difficult to express. He was, however, a laborious correspondent. Letters to his children might begin with a reflection on the weather and end with particularly in later years, with a damn and a blast at the government of the day, but their bulk consisted largely of what his children had already told him in their own letters, perhaps embroidered with a few paternal words of encouragement or rebuke. Among the more lively is his exchange between Bertie, then a midshipman in the HMS Collingwood, and his father. On Friday night, after I turned in, I fell out of my hammock with the help of someone else and hit my left eye on the chest. I was swelled up very much, and yesterday it was bandaged up. I did not cut it or actually hurt the eyeball, but it was very sore all the way around. It was much better today, but I expect I shall have a black eye a few days later. His father replied, "Sorry that with all the help of someone else you fell out of your hammock and hit your eye on your chest. It must have hurt a good deal, but glad it didn't damage your eye permanently. I should do the same to the other fellow if I got the chance." And here is the future King Edward VIII, then an Oxford undergraduate, giving his father a circumspect account of Bullingdon Club dinner. "Most of them got rather, if not to say very excited, and I came back early. There was a good deal of champagne drunk, and that accounted for it. It is interesting for me to see the various forms of amusement that undergraduates indulge in." David's letter evoked this reply: "I'm amused with your description of your dinner at Bullingdon Club. It appears that a good many of young men drank more champagne than was good for them, and became very noisy and excited. Different people have different ways of enjoying themselves. Although the Prince of Wales ensured that his children grew up with impeccable manners and an entire lack of high-born arrogance, which characterized so many other royal houses of Europe, his reputation as a father has been much disparaged in print. Even Harold Nicholson, in his tactful and urbane official life of King George V, felt impelled to write, in seeking to instill in his children his own ideas of duty and obedience, he was frequently pragmatic and sometimes harsh. Nicholson gave renewed currency to that disobliging view with an anecdote he omitted from his own book but later made available to Randolph Churchill to use in his biography. On the 17th Earl of Derby, since the story had been widely quoted to illustrate the king's unsympathetic character, it should be examined with a more critical eye than either Nicholson or Churchill brought to bear. Here, then, in Nicholson's words, is the tale which he claimed have heard from Lord Derby and subsequently told Randolph Churchill, who published it verbatim in 1959. It thus appeared in print for the first time nearly half a century after the episode it purported to record. Derby was distressed by the way the king bullied his children. He ventured one day at Knowlesy. Then they were walking up and down the terrace to raise the subject, justifying his remarks on the grounds that he was the king's oldest friends. He said what delightful companion his own children had become for him when they grew up, and begged the king to realize that the royal children were on the verge of manhood, and that he was missing very much in life by frightening them and continuing to treat them as if they were naughty schoolboys. The Lord Derby told me that the king remained silent for some 4 minutes after this, and then said, "My father was frightened of my mother, and I was frightened of my father, and I damn well am going to see to it that my children are frightened of me." An antidote almost a half a century old is likely to have suffered many vicissitudes. Derby, Nicholson, and Churchill were all truthful men, but Derby was not the most accurate of chroniclers. Nicholson he had sensibility sometimes, and it prompted him to improve the rough-hewn material of lesser stylists. Churchill was a biographer who inherited his father's relish for the drama of history. To put the matter more bluntly, there is hardly a detail of the story which resists scrutiny or can be confirmed from independent sources. Although born in the same year as the future King George V, Derby was neither his oldest nor his most intimate friend. The Duke of Buccleuch and Sir Charles Cuss, who mention only two, had longer and far stronger claims on the king's affection. Nor would Derby have risked royal displeasure by so bold a display of candor. Genial but irresolute, he was all things to all men. It is equally unlikely that the hot-tempered and outspoken king would have paused for 4 whole minutes while digesting Derby's admonition. Least convincing of all is the king's supposed retort. There is scarcely any reliable evidence that the future king, Edward VII, was frightened of Queen Victoria, known that the future King George V was frightened of King Edward. Each, in common with his generation, was brought up to respect his parents. On the steps of the throne, respect turned to awe. It is that numinous quality It is that numinous quality which throughout history has separated a prince from a president and a sovereign from his subjects, even when they happen to be his own children. Some may find it anachronistic in age of parliamentary democracy, yet they cannot deny its continuing potency. The Duke of Windsor well recognized the subtlety of the relationship when he wrote in his memoirs, "Kings and queens are only secondarily fathers and mothers." If Prince George was an anxious and overbearing father, Princess May was an uncommonly detached mother. The social conscience which she had inherited from the Duchess of Teck embraced the welfare of children in general rather than in her own brood. It prompted her in 1904 to question the Prime Minister about the adequacy of classrooms and meals in state schools. "When I went to Eton more than 40 years ago," Mr. Balfour replied unhelpfully, "few parents or masters thought it necessary either that our schoolrooms should be properly warmed or that we should have anything to eat before early school." Yet she hated the routine of childbearing and took no interest in babies. Like all affluent parents of that day, she delegated the upbringing of her children to others. There was nothing unusual or heartless in that. But even in York Cottage, a house no larger than a vicarage, she failed to discover that a nurse was physically ill-treating one of her sons and ruining the digestion of another for life. As the children grew up, Princess May's shyness and dissolved into warmth and gaiety, in contrast to the admonition and reproof which they associated with her father's library. Their mother's sitting room came to represent a sanctuary. She did her best to protect the adolescent princess from the rebukes of a man whose ingrained conservatism could not tolerate changing standards of behavior and dress. Yet her influence was limited. She believed that her duty was to a husband invested with both the lonely burden and the mystique of monarchy. "I always have to remember," she once said of her sons, "that their father is also their king." Whatever the failings of Princess May as a parent, she herself failed to recognize them. In 1908, Lord Esher sent her a copy of Edmund Goss's recently published Father and Son, that classic work of the upbringing of a sensitive child. "This book," the author explains, "it's a record of a struggle between two temperaments, two consciences, and two epochs. It ended as inevitable in its disruption." The princess thanked Esther warmly for his present. "I am delighted with Father and Son. Quite admirably written, as you say, and one thoroughly enters into the narrow-minded surroundings of the child's life and feels it's all so true and real. How misguided some people are," she ended her letter, "without realizing it." Even while the two eldest sons of the Prince of Wales were in the nursery, their father decided that they should one day follow him into the Royal Navy. In the spring of 1902, he appointed Mr. Henry Hansell to be their tutor. The son of a Norfolk squire, Hansell had taken second-class honors in history and at Oxford. He taught both public and preparatory schools and ensured that Prince Arthur of Connaught passed into Eton. "Absolutely straight but very broad-minded," Lord Derby wrote of him. "I can imagine no better able person to guide rather than to drive a boy." The prince agreed. "I shall always think his judgment is good." Hansell, however, shared Dalton's humor humorless solemnity without Dalton's intellectual appetite. He sent this report to the Prince of Wales when Bertie was 8. I'm very sorry to say that Prince Albert has caused 2 painful scenes in his bedroom this week. On the second occasion, I understand he narrowly escaped giving his brother a very severe kick, it being absolutely unprovoked. Although conscientious, Hansel was disqualified for his task more by muscle than mind. In youth, he had excelled at cricket and football. As an introspective bachelor of 40, and had spent his leisure at the helm of a sailing boat, or striding over the golf links, he lacked the inspiration of the born teacher. The Duke of Windsor later wrote of him, I do not wish to be critical of Mr. Hansel, but on looking back over those 5 curiously ineffective years under him, I'm appalled to discover how little I really learned. He could scarcely be said to have possessed a positive personality. If he harbored strong views about anything, he was carefully concealed of them. Although I was in his care on and off for more than 12 years, I am today unable to recall anything brilliant or original that ever was said. It is to Hansel's credit that he recognized the inadequacy of both his own talents and of any attempt to educate a future sovereign by private tuition alone. He repeatedly warned the Prince of Wales that if the boys were to hold their own at Naval College, they ought to exchange the seclusion of Sandringham for a well-managed preparatory school. There, he urged, they could benefit not only from a specialized curriculum, but also from the friendship and the rivalries of communal life. The prince would have none of it. My brother and I never went to a preparatory school, he told Hansel. The Navy will teach David all that he needs to know. The Prince of Wales also harbored Daltonian doubts about the wholesomeness of boarding schools. 30 years earlier, Queen Victoria had insisted that if Prince Eddie and Prince George were to be sent to Wellington College, they must live not in the school, but in a nearby, quite separate house. I have a great fear, she wrote, of young and carefully brought up boys mixing with older boys, and indeed with any boys in general. For that mischief done by bad boys and the things they may hear and learn from cannot be overrated. Her grandson, now grown to manhood, similarly feared the perils of a fashionable preparatory school. He would keep his children at home until they were old enough to join a well-supervised and morally accepted naval establishment. One shortcoming of Hansel's methods came to light when Prince of Wales discovered that his oldest son, in his 11th year, could not calculate the average weight of stags shot by his father at Balmoral during the previous stalking season. So he engaged a special tutor who taught the boys enough mathematics for each in turn to pass into the Naval College at Osborne. Their progress was not maintained. Prince Edward emerged from his first term, not far from the bottom. Prince Albert's place was the 68th out of 68. Princess May, who had no high opinion of Hansel, recognized the bleakness of his regime. She tried to modify it by introducing the children to her own cultural interests, yet she dared not challenge her husband's stubborn will. She had told Lord Esher, one of her very few confidants, see how George has suffered from not knowing French and German. The other day in Paris, I enjoyed everything, but he was not really amused. He knows nothing about pictures or history. He's told something about Francis the First, and it conveys nothing to him. He could not follow the plays easily, and it is a great pity. Her eldest son, she continued, ought to learn history and languages, even if he had to follow a different curriculum from the other cadets at Osborne. But her husband disagreed, she added, with a prophetic insight. Albert ought to be educated, also. Look at William the Fourth. He was a long way from the throne, yet he succeeded. Not until the Prince of Wales had ascended the throne in 1910 and come to realize the inadequacy of his own education did he concede that the Prince Edward's plan should be modified. The boy was to abandon his career in the Navy, he was to study in France and Germany, and to enter Magdalen College at Oxford as an undergraduate. The new king made another concession. During the early years of his reign, he sent his third and fourth son, Prince Henry, later the Duke of Gloucester, and Prince George, later the Duke of Kent, to St. Peter's Court, a preparatory school at Broadstairs on the south coast. Although they undoubtedly enjoyed a mixing with boys of their own age, Hansel may have exaggerated the academic galvanism of such institutions. The 12-year-old Prince Henry was told sharply by his mother, "Do for goodness sake wake up and work harder and use the brain that God has given you. All you write about is your everlasting football, of which I am heartily sick of." And Prince George, in spite of being the only one of the Princess May's children to inherit her aesthetic taste and collector's eye, fared no better than his brothers in the naval classroom. Prince Albert wrote of him, "He has kept up the best traditions of my family by passing out of Dartmouth, one from the bottom, the same place as I did." Now I'm going to pause there because we're at 47 minutes. And there is another 12 pages. So I'm going to do this in part 3 of Heir to the Throne. So I hope that you will see me there, and I need to give my voice a break. So thank you for listening.